Today we've got part 2 of the governor's elections that are coming up next year in 26. So we're going to go through another 12 states just like we did in part 1. The quick table of all the races is right here. There's 36 of them, and last time we left off on Illinois. So let's take a stroll through these next dozen states, and first up we've got Iowa. Now Iowa does not have term limits for their governor, so Kim Reynolds could decide to run for a third term. If she doesn't, there's plenty of Republicans that could step into that void. There's one listed here. We've got a state rep who's going to make an announcement this month, and notably Pat Grassley has declined to run for this office. That's the grandson of Senator Chuck Grassley. My guess is after the Chuck Grassley era, then largely due to his last name, Pat is going to step in to maybe try to run for that seat. So this is a moderately red state, but what about the Dems? They have a very weak bench here, but they do have one elected statewide Democrat. That's Rob Sand, the state auditor. So maybe Sand gives it a go, or maybe there's going to be a state senator or state rep, or maybe a former U.S. rep comes back into the picture and decides to run as well. Or it could be somebody entirely outside of politics. Now this state has become pretty red over the past decade plus, but governor usually gives the opposing political party a chance to make some inroads. And Kim Reynolds' popularity has fluctuated, but it's been relatively low as of late. She last won re-election very comfortably, so I think she would be at least favored if she ran again, even if the national environment does lean blue. But she might hang it up, then there could be a contentious primary. And right now this race is rated as either safe R, solid R, or battleground. So Dems would love to come back into a state like Iowa, but at this early point it's going to be an uphill climb. Next we've got Kansas, and this is a red state, but their governor is a Democrat, two-term Laura Kelly. However, she is going to be term limited. Both of her wins were by small margins, and now that it's an open seat, usually the expectation is the state would revert back to its natural partisan lean. So Republicans are really hoping to capture this seat. The Dems would love to hold on here, and so far they've got a few candidates here that might get into the race. So aside from that, there's going to be a bunch of Republicans vying for this seat. Right now, one declared candidate, that's Scott Schwab. You might be unaware, but his young son was actually killed a few years back in a horrific accident at a local amusement park. Aside from that, we've got former Governor Jeff Collier, and maybe you're looking at somebody like Chris Kobach. He would seem to be a more controversial candidate. So this should be fun to look at on both sides. I would guess Democrats don't want to have a bitter primary full of infighting. They're probably going to need to coalesce around somebody if they want to have a chance at holding that seat. So we'll see what happens here. But let's go on to Maine. We've got an open seat again. Janet Mills, the Democrat, she's term limited. And this state does lean blue. Democrats do have a bench here. You can see the potential candidates. Some of them I'm not familiar with at all, but my guess is any one of them would at least be competitive in a general election. The one I would guess would have the best chance is going to be Jared Golden. He's a blue dog Democrat in the U.S. House. He might be waiting for a Senate seat to open up, and if he does, I think he'd be favored for that. But if he's looking for a higher profile office, I think definitely in a general election he would have success. In a primary, he might face accusations of being a little bit too conservative. Now, Republicans do have a bunch of potential candidates listed here as well, but on a glance, I'm not sure if they've got any knockout candidates here. They did have two-term Governor Paul LePage before Janet Mills. However, something to keep in mind is this is a state that usually has a strong enough independent or third-party presence in the general election. So somebody might only win with a plurality like LePage did. And you can see here the predictions for this race are all over the place. We've got battleground, a lean D, and likely D. So that's what we've got going on in Maine. Let's go from the Pine Tree State to the Old Line State. We've got Maryland. This is not an open seat. This is going to be Wes Moore, Democrat, running for re-election. He's declared his candidacy. He's got his fundraising on here. He seems reasonably popular in a deep blue state. So what about the opposition? Well, the one candidate of note on here that's potential is going to be Larry Hogan, former two-term governor. The problem for Hogan is he's no longer in office. Wes Moore, as I said, is popular. It's hard to imagine Hogan actually dethroning an incumbent Democrat. So with Hogan or without Hogan, I think Wes Moore is heavily favored in this state. There is one poll here that shows Moore leading by 14 points over Hogan. So unless something dramatic happens, this should be an easy hold for the Dems. Next, we've got Massachusetts. This should similarly be an easy hold for the Dems. Maura Healey looks like she's running for her second term, as it shows here on February 7th. So nothing really to look at on that side. What about Team Red? Well, this is an extremely blue state. Republicans have little going on here, if anything. There's some candidates listed here, but one of them is not former Governor Charlie Baker. He was popular. Maybe he comes back into a different office in the future. But without somebody like that, there could be a bunch of different Republicans battling for this nomination. And they're going to have to decide if they want to go with a candidate that has more appeal with the Trump base, or if they want to go with a more moderate, centrist, or liberal direction. Trump-friendly candidates do not seem to have success in this state, and that makes sense. This is one of the bluest states out there. But even if it was Charlie Baker, even if it was a more liberal Republican, I think they might have to next wait until there's another open open seat, and you can see this race here is rated as solid D. Next, we've got a great one here. We've got Michigan. This is an open seat. Gretchen Whitmer is term limited. This should be a high-profile, bruising battle in the general election. It could also be the same thing for the primaries. Right now for the Dems, we've got Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson. She's the highest profile candidate already in. Mallory McMorrow here, I think she is actually going to run for the Senate. Now we've got some declined candidates here, including Pete Buttigieg. So maybe Jocelyn Benson just coasts to this nomination because she's from a statewide office, she's high profile. But what about the other side? How about the GOP? One declared candidate here, that's Eric Nesbitt. He's in the state Senate, he's not at all shying away from Donald Trump, so maybe that's the recipe in this state for success. But there's a huge list of other potential candidates here. Some of them are more Trump friendly, some are going to be more establishment friendly. I would guess it's not going to be Tudor Dixon, who already ran and lost back in 22 to Gretchen Whitmer. And you've also got John James here, who ran in back-to-back U.S. Senate elections, taking consecutive losses. It seems like he definitely wants to get to a higher office at some point. It could be governor, but he already has that stain of defeat on his resume. So there's a bunch of other candidates here. There's one poll. We've got John James actually leading with a commanding 46%. That was only from a few weeks ago. So it's way too early. We'll see what happens. But another thing to keep in mind here is we do have independent candidate Mike Duggan, who is the current mayor of Detroit. He's actually running as an independent, and that could be a gift to Republicans. He's definitely going to be highly associated with the Democrats. So I'm guessing they're going to either want to keep him off the ballot or try to discredit him. So there's definitely some interesting dynamics at work here for Michigan governor. Next, how about Minnesota? Now, this state does not have term limits for their governor, but we know who's in office. It's Tim Walz. He took the L in the presidential race, but maybe he goes back to Minnesota and runs for a third term. It's unclear what he's going to do, but he's definitely in position to do so. If it's not Walz, you're going to have a bench here. The only listed candidate here for the Dems is Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, but there should be more listed here over time if Walz decides not to run. Republicans, their bench is not stacked. Royce White, who just lost the U.S. Senate election, Amy Klobuchar, he's listed here as having interest in this seat. You've also got Scott Jensen, who ran and lost in 22. You've got U.S. Rep. Pete Stauber. This is another state where there could be a split between going toward the Trump base and going in a more centrist direction. And this is not an extremely blue state, but it does lean toward that direction. If it's an open seat, I would say this seat is totally in play for the Republicans. If it's Walz, I would have to think he's going to have the advantage. But this is the state that gave us Jesse Ventura back in 1998 from the Reform Party. There's always something potentially crazy that could happen. Let's go to the next state. How about Nebraska? Here's Republican Jim Pillen. He's eligible to run for a second term. Assuming that happens, I'm guessing he's easily going to be the nominee. And there's not even any Democrats listed here, but we do have independent candidate Dan Osborne. He ran and lost to Deb Fisher in the last Senate election. I think him running for governor would actually make more sense than running for the Senate. Governor is where things can happen if you're not the dominant political party. If he does go as an independent, my guess is Democrats would kind of coalesce around him in the background. But the storybook ending for Osborne might have a better chance of happening if it were an open seat, and it's not. Given that Pillen is probably going to run again, it would be tough to imagine him being defeated. So we'll see what happens in this one. But let's move on to Nevada. And here we've got Governor Joe Lombardo, the Republican. He's running for his second term. And there's divided government in this state. Lombardo has to deal with a Democrat-dominated legislature. So this is definitely a purple state. Republicans hoping to move it into their column more solidly over the next couple of elections. But there are some statewide elected Democrats here as well. We've got Aaron Ford. He's the current AG. He might jump into this race on that side. So I think for now, Lombardo is going to be popular enough to be able to hold this seat. But there is one poll here, and Lombardo does have a 21-point lead over Ford. But that was taken a long time ago. At the same time, we just saw incumbent Steve Sisolak, the Democrat, defeated by Joe Lombardo in the last election. If a blue wave national environment emerges, and if Lombardo does not maintain a high level of popularity, then he could easily be vulnerable in a general. So this should be a good race to follow. For now, there's not much to take a look at here. And we've also got New Hampshire, and this state does not have its own dedicated page just yet. There's only 2-year terms here. It's Kelly Ayotte. She's probably going to run for a second term, given that she just got into office. So that's one we'll take a look at in the future. Next state, it's New Mexico. This one is another open seat to replace Michelle Lujan Grisham. We've got one declared candidate here. That's Deb Haaland. You can see her credentials here. She was the U.S. Secretary of the Interior. She was a U.S. rep. So maybe she'll coast to the nomination. Maybe there'll be other Democrats getting into the race. But Republicans also hoping to have some success here. There's not a deep bench, no high-profile candidates just yet. You've got Nella Domenici listed here. She just took the loss in the U.S. Senate race, and it wasn't really that close of a margin. You've also got Yvette Harrell here. I could see her making a run as well. And this could be another state where you have a reasonable third-party presence. Remember, this is the state that Libertarian Gary Johnson is from. So in a general election, anything could happen. But there's no question that Democrats are going to have the upper hand here. But they did have two-term Republicans Susana Martinez before Lujan Grisham. down. So this state is open to electing a governor of either party. So we've got one state left, and it's a big one. It's New York. This is another state without term limits for their governor. And the current governor is Kathy Hochul, who has declared her intent to run for a second term. Now, her approval ratings have generally not been all that strong. Plenty of time left for her to turn things around, especially with Trump in office, if she tries to emerge as a resistance type of governor. But due to her shaky approval, she's very likely to get a primary challenge. And there's no shortage of candidates that could line up to do so. You've got Jamal Bowman, you've got Richie Torres. There's no question that Hochul does have some serious vulnerabilities. Now, on the Republican side, a couple of potential candidates here. I think there should be a few more listed here, but it's also way too early to say what's going to happen. The race was relatively a lot closer in 22 than prior elections. So I think Republicans do see a potential opening here, with the state shifting definitely a lot more towards Trump in the presidential election. So I think they're actually looking to run against Hochul and her record in the general election. But no matter who it is, I think Democrats definitely start off with the edge, if not a significant edge. But there's so much time left, there's so many different issues that are going to be in motion. Republicans are not at all going to just write off the seat. They're going to need a strong candidate with a wide appeal. Maybe they pull out the next George Pataki and have an upset here. We'll find out. There's one potential hypothetical poll here, and Siena College, which polls the state regularly, they've got Kathy Hochul at 33% and different candidate at 57%. That was from back in December. So things could change multiple times over the next year. But this is a big time race that the Democrats cannot take for granted. So that's it for part 2 of this governor's preview. There's plenty of notable races out there, coast to coast, lots to take a look at. A lot is going to change. So we'll look at the remaining states in part 3. But let me know in the comments, what do you think about any of the races in this video? Which ones do you think are most likely to flip? And do you think Democrats might be boosted by the national environment? And what about primary challenges? What about any dark horse candidates? Let me know down below. On your way out, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join if you'd like to support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.